Hello, everyone. This is Lala, and I've seen a lot of discourse about the Snow White movie, which I didn't have an intention on watching. I don't have an intention on watching it currently, and I doubt I ever will for the rest of my life. But that's not really what interests me about this. What interests me about it is the reaction towards Rachel Zegler, her supposed racial makeup, infighting within the white community, and why white gatekeeping is so upheld, and other nuances in regard to this. I made a similar video regarding Nicole Parker with the How to Train Your Dragon that I'm probably going to redo or add a continuance as the film gets closer to release, but it's honestly just so ridiculous that I felt like I needed to comment on it. Obviously, the main thing that is brought up when it comes to the whole Snow White controversy is that Rachel Zegler isn't white. Well, she isn't Snow White. On one end, I could understand that she's a bit too tanned for someone who's as white as snow, supposedly, but there's a lot more to this than that. But before I get into it, the first thing we have to do is break down her racial slash or ethnic background or breakdown. Okay, so I'm going to her Wikipedia page, and it mentions that her mother is of Colombian descent, and her maternal grandmother migrated from Barranquilla, so I'm assuming that is a city in Colombia, to the United States in the 1960s, and her father is of Polish descent. Okay, so Polish descent, meaning you're from Poland, meaning that you are a white Polish person. And like I mentioned, Colombia or Colombia is a Latin American country, so that would be half Latino, and I've said this 1,000 times. Latino is not a race. When I'm talking about someone's racial makeup, stating Latino really isn't helpful. Is this Colombian heritage mestizo? Is it white? Is it black? Is it mulatto? What type of racial Latino are you talking about? This isn't really clear. During her childhood, she says she faced racial discrimination on social media due to her mixed ethnicity. Okay, so ethnicity and race are two different things. Notice how it says mixed ethnicity, not mixed race, right? So that kind of has a question mark because if you could be a white person with two different white ethnicities and be of mixed ethnicity, but not mixed race. Same thing with how you can be a black person with two different black ethnicities, making you mixed ethnically but not racially. Same thing with an Asian person if you're from two Asian ethnicities, that would mean you are of mixed ethnicity, not mixed race. So that alone kind of just has me thinking, okay, something's fishy here. So, just from the discourse that I've seen just from looking at Twitter and other stuff, there is a debate about whether she's actually Latina or not, where there's this whole discussion about if you're not born in a Latin American country, then you aren't a Latina. So they're saying that her being born in the US means that she's not Latina, and her having a grandmother who was born in Colombia doesn't mean that she is Latina. It means her grandmother is a Latina, and it means that Rachel has Latina or Latin American descent. And there's a lot of focus on her grandmother, where apparently her grandmother's the Colombian one, where her mother, Rachel's mother, might be half Latina and half white, and then making Rachel a quarter Latina and 3/4 non Latina white. I don't know, but that's the discourse that I've been seeing. And apparently, this came up during the West Side Story production and promotion where people accused her of not being Latina enough because Maria, the main character, is a Puerto Rican woman, where Rachel's one, not Puerto Rican at all. Two, she's half Colombian, half Latina, maybe a quarter, and the other half or the other 3/4 is white. So they didn't see her as not Latina enough. So that came up a lot during this point in time, and it started coming up again. Okay, so as you see by the title, she's identified as a white Latina, meaning that she is a white person who has Latina heritage, or a white person who is a Latino, since, as I've mentioned and will continue to mention, Latina is not a race. And this is how she identifies as this, because it says Rachel Zegler on responsibility and privilege as a white Latina in Hollywood. So we're going to scroll down. Okay. Rachel Zegler, the young actress who plays Maria in Steven Spielberg. Okay, so this was during the press of West Side Story. Hold on, let's see. Yes, in fact, there are quite a few critics who don't believe Zegler is Latina enough to have been given this role at all. In a recent interview on Variety's Awards Goods podcast, the actress chatted with Variety's Film Awards editor Clayton Davis on taking the iconic role of Maria and the privileges that come with being a white Latina in Hollywood. So yet again, she self-identifies as a white Latina. Towards the latter half of the interview, Davis goes on to address a lot of the controversy around Zegler landing the role of Maria, as she is half Colombian and half white. Colombian is a nationality, not a race, and obviously half white is a race. Clearly, they meant half Latina, Colombian, and half non-Latina white. He posed the question to her about why there seems to be such a lack of understanding when it comes to what Latinx is. I know a lot of Latinos don't like the Latinx term, but that's besides the point. Zegler takes this moment to not only address the narrow view of understanding folks herself surrounding Latina dad, but also to owning up about her white Latina privilege and the responsibilities that come with that. People find comfort in boxes is really what I've learned, and people found comfort in the bubbles they were filling out for standardized tests. Interesting. And I don't understand it because they made me uncomfortable. Ziegler says, because I am a white Latina, meaning that she's a white woman who just happens to be a Latina, I hold a lot of privilege, and if that's the conversation people want to have about my privilege in this industry, then am absolutely welcome to have that conversation. Because, yeah, it falls on my shoulders to open up the doors for the people who aren't, or they are disenfranchised in this industry. Having Ariana DeBose at the front of a beautiful film this season is an incredible thing, and hopefully not the last of its kind for a long time. Where we have to have this conversation of, oh, an Afro Latina taking as a lead for the first time since Ariana DeBose. I don't want that conversation to ever take place again. It's pointless to box people and say that you're not this enough or you're not that enough. What dictates that? Who dictates that? So clearly, she sees the difference between a white Latina and an Afro Latina. It's not like she's identifying as a mestizo. Regarding Zegler's biracial, again, she would only be biracial if her type of Latina was non white. And bicultural, you could still be a monoracial person and be bicultural. I don't see how that's the same thing. Anyways, identity. The actress admits that she's grown to resent constantly being referred to as half and half. She believes that her identity is her own. Yeah, my dad is white. He's American. His family has been in this country for many, many, many years. And the same can be said for my other side of the family. I'm more immersed in my Colombian culture than I've ever been immersed into my American culture. So why does someone else get to tell me what I am? She asks. I don't know. I grew up in a house that spoke the language. It was never really taught to me because there's this idea from my abuelita since my mom was a kid and when I was a kid that you will be American. You will speak English, you will go to an American school, and you will get a good job and make money and have a family. And that's the life that's set up for you before you are born. And I do know that a lot of people mention that she isn't Latina because she doesn't speak Spanish, so that's a whole nother layer into that. Zegler talks about the importance of being able to carve out your own identity while also making it clear that she's well aware of the privileges that comes with being a Latina who looks like her, especially in Hollywood, an industry that still, to this day, prefers to give leading roles to white Latinas as opposed to black or indigenous Latinas. So she knows she's not a black Latina, she knows she's not an indigenous Latina, and those are the two Latinos that aren't white. So if her Latino side was either black or indigenous and she had her white parent, then she would be biracial. Let's continue. And I just don't really understand why people think that certain facets of your life dictate your identity. The thing about my identity is that it's my own, and this is the way that I navigate through the world, and nobody knows my day-to-day struggles, she said. Like I said, I'm a white Latina. I don't get stopped on the street for the way that I look. That is my privilege. But when I speak Spanish on the subway, I've been spit on. Again, Spanish is a language. Hispanic is a language identifier. Language isn't necessarily specifically tied to a specific race. I've been told to go back to where I came from, even when I was born in suburban New Jersey. It doesn't matter to these people, but they're the same people that will hide behind a profile on Twitter and tell me that because my dad is American or because my mom wasn't born in Colombia or because I wasn't born in Colombia that my identity is invalid. Again, xenophobia. Anyone can face xenophobia because it's based on a cultural and an ethnic barrier. It's a sibling of race, but not necessarily the same as race. The 20-year-old actress believes that there's no point in fighting with folks who obviously already made up their minds about how they choose to perceive people. Her advice to young Latinx folks is to focus on how you feel about yourself, the way you navigate your own identity, and how you advocate for yourself and others. And like I said, I'm a white Latina in an industry that's not necessarily kind to Latinas, but definitely more kind to white Latinas than anything. So it becomes my job to make sure that these doors are open to other Latinos who are not necessarily, they don't fix or, yeah, they don't fix the box. I think they meant fit the box, but that's besides the point. She adds, while we hear a lot of white women these days acknowledging their privileges, so again, acknowledging that she's a white woman and making efforts to pass the mic to women of color, we don't necessarily hear enough white Latinas, particularly in Hollywood, publicly acknowledging the privileges that come with being white Latinx, while also owning up to the responsibilities that come with that. I have a lot of reasons for that, and I think it's because you tend to notice that a lot of them tend to hop in and out of white status when it benefits them, and a lot of them hop in and out of being a marginalized person of color to their benefit. That's why you don't hear a lot of white Latinas talking about their privileges when it comes to being white. According to a recent Pew Research study, Latinxes with darker skin report more experiences of discrimination than Latinxes with lighter skin colors. I'm so shocked. This isn't anything we didn't already know, and yet the white Latinx conversation still tends to be missing the mark when it comes to responsibility. And I kind of just covered why that conversation's never really had, and why there's a lack of accountability in general. And I think it's because we are focusing on what other races or other cultures do, so they can kind of feel superior, while also not addressing the issues within their community and their industry, whether it's in the U.S. or their own country, with any validity or with any seriousness. They don't want to break the colorism or the racism or the featureism in their community, so they just don't address it at all. The truth is that while being white Latinx could come with constantly having your identity and heritage questioned, it also comes with privilege. That privilege being not facing the systemic racism that Black Latinos or Latinxes do. They don't get stopped in the street because of the color of their skin. They're the first ones considered for Hollywood roles, and they still meet a lot of the Eurocentric beauty standards on women. So this is clearly what Rachel Zegler fits in. This is why so many folks were furious when Selena Gomez landed the cover for Latinx Heritage Month issue, because it just felt more of the same. So this is also acknowledging that Selena Gomez is a white Latina. And while Ariana DeBose playing Anita in West Side Story has been major, the truth is, if she were given the role of Maria, a lot of racist people would have been pissed. We're clearly still not there yet. But it's refreshing to see a young actress like Zegler understanding the responsibility and using her platform to open doors for others. Simply acknowledging your privilege isn't enough anymore. We should be past that by now, and in 2022, it sounds like bragging. It's the work that needs to be done after acknowledging privileges that matters, and Zegler seems to be prepared to do that. You can't make a public statement like that without expecting the community to eventually hold you accountable, so trust that they will. So there's a lot of discussion about Rachel's phenotype and obviously her parentage. So let's actually look and see what they look like. Okay, so Rachel Zegler parents. Okay, so Let's just read this again. Rachel Zegler's parents are Gina and Craig Zegler, with Gina being of Colombian descent and Craig of Polish descent. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, Colombian is not a race. You could be a black Colombian, you could be a mestizo Colombian, you could be a white Colombian. And as you see here, they look white, but let's go through the images to see better. Okay, so you see Rachel, and then you see her parents. He would be the Polish one, she would be the Colombian one. Okay, just looking at Rachel. Okay, I see light skin, Eurocentric features, from her nose to her lips to her eyes and bone structure, her hair texture, her skin color. Woman, right? Her mother, very thin nose, thin lips, Eurocentric features, and this is the Colombian woman. Okay? If she was a mestiza, you would see a decent amount of indigenous features. You don't see that. She's obviously not an indigenous Latina because she would look indigenous. She's not a mulatto Latina since you would see black features, and she's obviously not a black Latina. So this is a white Colombian woman with a white man who is a Latino with their white daughter. Let's move on. Okay, I'm looking at the pictures. Okay, her mother has a bit of a tan, and just from this picture, maybe her father does too, but having a tan doesn't mean you're not white. White people actually have many different skin tones within their gradient. It's a spectrum there. Um, Rachel's lighter than her parents in this picture, so I don't see any indigenous or black feature or a non-white feature looking at them. That she and her sister also looks white because they are. Rachel and her parents. Okay, as you see here, thin noses, thin lips, Eurocentric features, they look white. I'm not seeing this non-white person that everyone's talking about. Where? Okay, her mother and father. It's a black and white picture. Her father looks darker than her mother here. Okay, nothing really notable here. Her father, she's lighter than her father, so clearly I don't know what they're talking about when they say, oh, she's so dark skinned, she's olive, she's brown skinned. What are they talking about? Okay, we've seen this picture before. Rachel looks lighter than everyone in her family here. Um, again, I see Caucasoid, white features. I don't know where this is coming from. Looks pretty white to me. I don't. Can someone explain to me where these non-white features are? I don't see them. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for now. So clearly, just from looking at it, her mother is a white Colombian, meaning Rachel's Latina heritage is white. A white Latina procreating with a white non-Latino person creates another white person. So where is all this controversy coming from? Obviously, the main thing that comes from this controversy, or at least when it comes to the talking points, is Snow White's characteristics, or these physical characteristics, where one, she has to be very beautiful, and two, she also has to be white as snow. It's literally in the description of the character in the movie, and I think in the books. And when you have someone who belongs to this quote unquote brown group where no one has yet to explain to me what the brown is when it comes to a racial group, but when someone is not as pale as white as snow, when it comes to the skin color, obviously it's going to bring a lot of commentary. Though I definitely do think people went too far with it. Just looking at her skin color, she's really not brown. I would consider her a bit tan, but she doesn't have the skin color that is as white as snow. So I do see where the controversy came with that, but really, it's really just a dog whistle to go after people who aren't Anglo-Saxon or Northwestern European. And then there's a lot of gaslighting, a lot of virtue signaling about, oh, she's brown, oh, and then they say a bunch of xenophobic commentary about it. And then they ask, how dare you represent our Aryan queen? Like they really gave an F about Snow White. It's ridiculous. Like, just look at some of these comments. Like, it's ridiculous. Oh, F the brown woman we cast as Snow White for work brand points. Had the nerve to support brown people. What is a brown person? Seriously. I've heard this for South Asian people. I've heard this for indigenous people. I've heard this for Hispanic people, but like I mentioned, Hispanic is not a race, especially when a lot of them are white. So, what's the correlation there? But it definitely does. Like, look at Mud Brown. This is so ridiculous. And I will say Pedro Pascal is the only Latino person who I've seen stand up for Rachel Zegler under any circumstance. And that was literally yesterday, I believe, as I'm recording this. Yes, I do think she's a bit tan for the role, but I'm not going to use that to act like this woman isn't white. And calling someone like Rachel Zegler brown erases the actual brown Latinos who has darker skin tones and they have non-white features. It's complete erasure, and this is why I don't like the title of brown being used for all Latinos, because one, Latino's not a race. You could be any race and be Latino, and two, you're actually erasing the actual people who would fit the brown category, and three, brown really isn't categorized or explained well as to what it is. Not because Snow White was slightly brown. I don't see where it is. Casting a non-white person for a character called Snow White is actually hilarious. At least change the name to Snow Brown or something. People are being very convenient when it comes to race and ethnicity. It's funny how they always mention, oh, she's brown, she's brown, she's brown, she's Latino, so she's not white, but they completely ignore her polar side, which is white, and acting like Latinos can't be white. But it's coming from that same demographic who conveniently moves the goalposts whenever it's convenient. They are not akin to logic. They are really emotional. Brown or Snow Black. And here's another thing, Snow Black. What do black people have to do with this? They're connecting things that don't have to do with anything so they can verbiage out their stupid rhetoric. Casting a white woman for Jasmine. They actually did cast a white woman for Jasmine, which we saw on the animated version. And heck, even the person cast for Jasmine in the live action version was half white. And besides the point, Arab's not a race. So, yeah, you can still be white and an Arab. And another, yes, this comment reminds me of another element that I think comes from it. So, how do you F up making a movie about a queen wanting Snow White's beauty by casting the queen with a woman that is way hotter than the woman playing Snow White? I do think a lot of the controversy does come from the looks of Gal Gadot and Rachel Zegler, where they claim Rachel Zegler isn't pretty enough to be Snow White, where Gal Gadot is beautiful, and it caused a lot of people to somewhat feel sorry for Gal Gadot, or they feel like casting these two women and having it focus on their looks is kind of contradictory, and it kind of takes you out of the plot because a lot of people just don't see it as believable. Okay, so what does this say? The TikToker is discussing it because many people compare her skin to snow instead of thinking it and genuinely believe she's supposed to be that pale, which is not in the Disney version. Also, Rachel Zegler's skin is not brown and her race is white. She's a white Latino. Actually, no, I don't need to like it right now. But yes, no one's skin tone is literally white, so people getting upset about that is ridiculous. Okay. Yeah, I clicked the actual article. White Hispanic and Latino Americans. White Hispanic and Latino Americans, also called Euro Hispanics, Euro Latino, are Americans of white ancestry and ancestry from Latin America. That's really all it is. I don't know why this is so complicated. It also refers to people of European ancestry from Latin America that speak Spanish natively and immigrated to the United States. I've tried to keep my mouth shut because it's like arguing with a bunch of brick walls who hate me for things. Oh, this is actually her. Okay. I've tried to keep my mouth shut because it's like arguing with a bunch of brick walls who hate me for things I cannot control. My skin color. I am a white woman. So she says it right here. She's a white woman. Which, yeah, duh. Just looking at her, it's very obvious. And the fact that they don't find me attractive enough. And I think that's the real crux of it is they don't find her attractive enough. And I don't know if a part of this is due to them feeling like quote unquote brown people or quote unquote Latino people aren't attractive enough to represent their Aryan Anglo queen. But when you're spewing idiotic rhetoric, I gotta speak up. Okay. I wanna go to the actual comment. Stupid person comparing the color of snow to the animation. Of course, going to be the same because if they apply the same color, then Snow White is going to look like Casper. But the color in the animation indicates that she is white and not brown. My skin color is brown, but I want her to be white, and that is not racism or any shape or form because that's just how we grew up knowing Snow White. I do get their live action version to be similar to what they saw with the animation. That I get. But yet again, where is the brown coming from? Okay. Yes, Rachel is white. Brown. You know what? Hold on. Initially white, predominantly brown. She's predominantly white. People, like, these people have no logic in their head. Y'all see someone with a tan and think someone is brown. Not everyone burns in the sun like you. And that's pretty much true. Like, these people just be talking out of their asses. I want to see some more from this. Okay. Exactly white has no, it's a hyperbole, only abandoned people have the skin, and people aren't literal white. And Snow White follows the exact description should end up looking like a vampire. People couldn't even grasp that fairest is referred to as the most beautiful, not the palest. Rachel embodied Snow White perfectly, she's the perfect choice. And I did hear that from the people who actually watched it, she's the best part of the movie, but they can't even get out of their own hatred. Okay, if a full white and non-Latina woman with darker skin than Rachel played Snow White, no one would be complaining. I definitely agree with that. We all know it's not Disney's 1937 description that people truly care about, and it's clear. Rachel's skin is even much darker than 1937 Snow White. And that's really true. If calling Snow White Snow Brown is racist, was it racist before? I cleared up. You're just a dumbass. Okay. Today, while eating, this girl who was sitting with me and my friends at our table with her friends were talking about the Snow White movie, and she OMG said, she's Snow White. Like, she's supposed to be white. Why is she brown? Like, babe, you're Tunisian. Why are you hating on your own So you're comparing Tunisians to white Latinos. They're not even... You know what? Let me just move on. It's not that she's Latina. It's because she's brown. Snow White is pale. That's the whole damn point. There are many white Latinas that they could have picked. Yes, white Latinas exist. I see not even a 10. I see like a peachy, pale peach color. That's what I see. Okay, let's scroll down. Blah, blah, blah. Movie didn't need to exist. I agree with that. Okay. Like, calling this woman brown is literally just erasing brown. Okay, let's go to the main one. No, I want to be seeing Snow Brown. Like, you thought you were really eating with that. Okay, let's look up, hold on, let's go to Google. Brown Latino. And we're gonna go through the pictures. Does Rachel Zegler look like any of these people? Skin tone wise, facial feature wise, phenotypically, like, not at all. Like, I like, when you're looking at these people, I'm looking at her, and I'm going to do something soon where I compare them side by side. And even with the lighter skinned ones, you clearly see by their phenotype that they have some non-European phenotypical traits. Like this woman, she has her nose, her cheekbones, her eyes, even the shape of her lips. Like you can tell there's a difference. Okay? Like you can clearly see the difference. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Rachel Zegler. Look at this! Like, do you see the phenotypical similarities? Do you see the skin tone similarities? I don't. Like, I'm really trying to see it. Like, where? And as you see here, like, you see brown Latinos, and it's just, like, you see the title. Let me scroll down more pictures. Like, you see highly melanated people in most, if not all of these people, and you see very strong non-European features, whether it's African features or indigenous features, something that Rachel doesn't have in any. Like, even this woman, she's lighter skinned, but you can clearly tell by her phenotype that she's not a white woman. She has a lot of admixture. Like, you can see the difference. Mariah. Okay, Mariah ain't no brown. Okay, now let's do this. Ooh, white Latinos. Doesn't she look a lot more like these people? Skin tone wise, facial features. That dude's an Asian man. You get the point. Let's go down. Like, you clearly see the difference, right? Now let's look at more pictures of her so we can really break this down. Okay. I'm gonna click on that article. We're gonna see that. I really love this video. Y'all should check it out. It really describes everything perfectly. Okay, let me see. White Latino celebrities. If it shows up. Yeah, like, look, you can clearly see these people. Very thin European features, very light skin, minimal to no traces of African or indigenous features, like Rachel. Like if you put most, if not all of these people in a white European country, you couldn't tell the difference, like at all. I'll do 10 more pictures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I literally made a video breaking down the different types of Latino people. I feel like I've done this a few times. But, yeah, hold on. Let me see what this article is. Where do white Latinos belong in America? And you can see here, this meant a bit more tan, but still looking at its features, you still see the European phenotype, same as Sofia Vergara, I don't remember who this is, and same thing with Selena Gomez. Okay. So, both my parents are Cuban, but I can blend perfectly into Northampton. Cocaine mallet in hand, I worked hard to disguise my accent in professional settings after learning that white colleagues and superiors took me more seriously if I spoke like them. Again, that's linguistic, not racial. Someone from, ironically, Poland can come to America with a Polish accent and not knowing much English and only knowing Polish and go through the same thing. I experienced violent prejudice, but only after consciously identifying myself as a member of an out group. Meaning, if I didn't say what I was, no one would notice that I'm a different type of white person. I feel apart and excluded from white American culture but benefit from being mistaken as a member, because phenotypically you are. Okay. I have a chip on my shoulder. When walking through the white world, no one questions whether I belong in Starbucks, Nordstrom, or Omaha, Nebraska, because race is also based on phenotype. However, I usually experience some standoffish when crossing the threshold into Latino land. Okay, this could be at a cafeteria, Dia de los Muertos celebration, or salsa festival. My fellow Latinos look askance me, wondering what I'm doing in their diamond. I can clear this up relatively quick by saying something very loud in Spanish, therefore lifting my daywalker disguise and letting everyone know that I'm un blanquito, but I belong. Constantly proving my ethnicity to other Latinos is tiring, but it pales when compared to the exhausting, demoralizing, and constant microaggressions experienced by tens of millions of other minorities in this country who do not blend into white society. Thank you for acknowledging your white privilege. I can outwardly tailor my ethnicity to best suit my needs, but I can be the biggest concubine. Okay. I know this piece will elect a deluge of recommendations from other white Latinos. After all, this isn't the first time I brought this hard book. Yes, we have also been and continue to be victims of bigotry. Yes, we and or our antecedents face tremendous adversity when arriving in this country. Yes, many of us attain financial support despite these obstacles, but none of that negates the advantages that we are afforded. Privilege is a spectrum, not an absolute. White Latinos face less discrimination than others who do not immediately stick out in white-dominated spaces. And from Rachel has stated, this is her experience. Even when our accents or mannerisms give us away, we still look like the in-group, because race is based on phenotype. This makes white people in positions of power far more likely to perceive us, and have been called this numerous times, as the quote-unquote good Latinos. We're the exceptions and the modern minorities, because we look like them. So where do white Latinos belong in America? By vociferously supporting our fellow minorities, we are more likely to gain entry into white-dominated spaces because of our appearance. This also makes the inhabitants of those spaces more likely to drop their guards to exhibit implicit and explicit biases. This is when we need to step up and make clear that their bigotry is unacceptable. Okay, I'm skimming some of this. We should not mistake backdoor entry into a white power structure as wholehearted acceptance. But when you look at the history of the United States when it comes to white Latinos, this has been the case. White Latinos are still an outgroup in this country. We should make common cause with other marginalized communities struggling with advantage already granted to us, but it just never doesn't happen in reality. We've seen this. Lastly, we need to reflect on our own bigotry. Blatant racism is rampant amongst white Latinos. Suggesting otherwise is barefaced self-delusion. We inherited the worldview of our Creole ancestors who brutalized black and native people across Latin America with the same ferocity as their counterparts in the Deep South. The Spanish colonial racial hierarchy, peninsular, Creole, Mestizo, Mulatto, Indo, and Negro, in that order, is still very much enforced in Latino communities, just as much in Miami as Mexico City. Calling out our abuelos, parents, and generational peers is difficult. We risk starting fights, straining relationships, and ending friendships. It's much easier to roll our eyes and change the subject. But these norms need to be made unacceptable. We have some house cleaning to do, and it needs to begin now. As day walkers, white Latinos can move through white spaces without being burnt, but we don't really belong. We are welcome while we speak and laugh and look like the in-group, but we can't fake it. That for us is advantageous over so many Black, Native, Latino, Middle Eastern, and Asian people were never granted. That's because throughout US history, they, heck, even the mestizo ones, identified as white. Let me see if we can do some comparisons. Even comparing her to some of these mestizo people, like you clearly see a notable difference in phenotype and appearance. Like it just doesn't add up. And calling Cara brown is erasing these people who actually have borderline brown skin, very melanated skin. They have very mestizos have very Amerindian phenotypes and facial features. But that's what you do when you claim white people to represent non-white people, or people who are closer to whiteness represent people who aren't deemed white at all. So I think the main thing when it comes to this whole Rachel White Latina stuff is that you have to go back to the historical context where in Latin America there is a process or several processes akin to a blanqueamiento or medalla raza. I know my pronunciation isn't good. I'm not a Spanish speaker. Where pretty much they had this belief where they needed to improve the race, and in order to do so, they needed to breed out whatever blackness or indigenousness, whatever, any black heritage slash DNA and any indigenous heritage slash DNA that they had, and in order to do that, they would encourage all of their children or all of their relatives, descendants to procreate with white people. So let's just say a black person creates with a white person to create a biracial child. That biracial child procreates, or that mulatto child procreates with a white person to create a 3/4 white person. Then they procreate with a white person to create a 7/8 white child, so on and so forth. So their lineage becomes white, and it's the same thing with a native person procreating with a white person, them having a mestizo child, then that mestizo child procreating with a white person, creating a castizo child, and then that castizo child procreating with a white person to procreate a person who is 7/8 white, so on and so forth. So that's how it is in Latin America, or that's how it was at least in the colonial portions of it, though there's still remnants of that remaining today, where there's a lot of anti-blackness, anti-indigenous, or anti-nativeness, and there's a lot of elements within those countries that are heavily white, worshipping, and borderline white supremacist. There are even policies where a lot of these countries blocked out migration from Africa or from non-white countries, and they were open-armed when it came to European immigration, and it could be from anyone who had European descent or lived in Europe, so they could whiten their populations. Some countries were more successful at this than others, a la Argentina trying this and it not working the best in the Dominican Republic and a few others. So being white held a lot of virtue and value in these countries. But the thing with colonialism and different types of colonialism is how the Spanish ran things is different than how the Anglo-English people ran things. So when a lot of these white Latinos, who are the top of the top of the top and the most privileged within their countries and cultures and communities, migrate to the United States, historically, and even somewhat today, a lot of them are considered white. They were legally classified as white. They fought for that legal classification when they were given opportunities to identify as other, which we especially saw with the Mexicans during the 1930s, and they actively rejected that. They talked about how they're Caucasian, Caucasoid, and they were white. And they got that access from the Anglo-Americans and the Northwestern Europeans, who really kind of controlled how race and whiteness was viewed and is viewed in the United States. But there's a bit of a dilemma here where, because the United States is an Anglo country, you have to follow the Anglo rules. And the Anglo white people are not going to put the Hispanic white people above themselves. So, due to that little conflict there, the Hispanic white Latinos are put below the northwestern Europeans. And they felt othered due to that. But that's mainly due to linguistics and culture, not race. Obviously, there are a lot of mestizo mixed and or mulatto mixed Latinos or just multiracial Latinos in general. So them not being white makes sense as to why they aren't seen as that. Though, even historically, a lot of them were identified as white. They fought for that label, they got that label, they went to the white schools and all of that jazz. But obviously, due to the culture and them having significant admixture, things started to kind of change when it came to them receiving more discrimination, but they're still labeled as white. And then there's the whole sentence changes when it came to the Latino label, which became very controversial because Latino slash Hispanic is not a race and they're being categorized compared to other racial groups. So there's that. And then now, supposedly in 2030, the Hispanic slash Latino is going to be its own race. Though it's weird because Francophone isn't considered its own race because it's a linguistic term, and it's the same thing with Anglophone not being considered a race because it's a linguistic term. It's not even like they're saying mestizo is the race, where a lot of Latinos would apply. They're not doing that. They're just saying Hispanic slash Latino, which is way too broad of a term. And then it's very interesting that when it comes to Latino representation and creating Latino media or Hispanic media in the United States, yet again, it's almost always white Latinos who are put in the forefront. They're the ones who are gatekeeping who is or isn't allowed in the community, and they're the ones talking about how they're discriminated against, though they don't really take accountability for the discrimination that they place themselves on their non-white Latino counterpart within the Latin American industry or media, and especially in their own countries, where the representation is beyond abhorrent. So you have a group of people who are white and they are allowed in the club, but they're made to feel like they are the sidekicks that no one really wants, or they're seen as lesser than, despite them supposedly having all the privilege in the world. So that's just my opinion. I want to go on a Reddit thread or two and see how they talk about the issue and how they define it. So I wanted to go on Reddit to see what people think of this whole conversation regarding white Latinos and the dichotomy in the racial conversation, pretty much. So r slash Indian country, that was one person. Okay, so this is a Native American and Indigenous subreddit. So it's clearly about people with that descent. So their perspective on this is definitely going to be a bit different. So as you see here, the title is Why Are White Latin Americans and White Hispanics Called People of Color slash Minorities in America and Grouped with Latin American slash Immigrant of Indigenous American Descent? So this person's a Peruvian Quechua. Essentially, they're second generation, born to immigrant parents, and they found this strange. So we're going to look at some of the answers and break it down. So this person says, in my opinion, I think it happens in part because white Hispanics can be placed in an other category due to xenophobia from white Americans. But literally anyone can be othered in that element, since there are many white people from many different ethnicities and ethnogenesis. They have many different languages, customs, cultures, so on and so forth. So they can be othered by any of that, but that doesn't mean that they're not white. You get what I'm saying? Anyways. Though that logic changes nothing about the race, so it doesn't hold up very well, which is true. I think there's solidarity to be had for migrants of or children of migrants in the USA, but there's a weird lack of understanding many white Hispanics seem to not have about the intersections of race that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that's kind of yeah, as this person says, white Hispanics have privileges that they won't acknowledge. Okay, then this person mentions that there's some when they're in college, in undergraduate, they felt some sort of solidarity about being Spanish speakers, but that's about it. Because again, that's about linguistics, not race. And especially if you go to certain public spaces and people speak the same language as you, or you all only speak of that language, you have that commonality, but it doesn't mean that you share the same racial group. Okay. So this person says, in my opinion, I believe a big part of this is the individual settler colonial projects that took place across Latino or Latin America, and especially Mexico, given its immediate proximity to the US, which definitely makes sense. From the Spanish conquest of 500 years ago to now, the idea of mestizaje, hopefully I said that properly, has blurred the line of indigenous and European ancestry in favor of a national identity. I believe that because of their ignorant experience with Spanish-speaking people, specifically, Americans group all people of so-called Hispanic heritage in the same category. And I definitely do think that makes sense because when a lot of people think of Spanish speaking, they think of Mexico because it's the only country right below their border, though there's so many other Spanish speaking countries within the world, so it's kind of an ignorant take. Though, like the top paragraph mentions, there's been this push to form a single identity based on national race or whatever. Okay, and this person agrees, especially considering in the US we say Latinos slash Hispanics are an quote unquote ethnic group, and the way we define ethnicity in the USA is racial, which makes no sense. If you're going by race, we should go by race, using a language descriptor, and only this specific language descriptor for an ethnic group makes absolutely no sense. So, for instance, most people in the USA think you are born Latino regardless of your upbringing, just the same as being born a black or white person. In their mind, it is genetic or blood based. Okay. This person says, once upon a time, Irish weren't considered white. White doesn't entirely refer to skin color. Yes, white is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. WASP. This is something even white colored people don't understand. It's a club most of us aren't in. My immigrant ancestors were Irish on my mom's side, and I can show you my WASP grandmother on my father's side had a whole feeling about it. I have mad respect for the culture and power of pre-Columbian indigenous people and appreciate the flow of commerce and culture in the Americas before colonization. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and better understand our perspectives shared. This is kind of true, but even back in those days, when you look at the legal classifications, they were definitely white. They were just severely othered compared to today. They still went to the white schools. They didn't have to deal with segregation. They definitely dealt with a lot of stuff, and they're seen as low tier whites that they really wanted nothing to deal with. And if they could get away with not including them as whites, they would have. So this person says colonialism. The intent was to erase indigenous ancestry and lump everyone into one category regardless of race. Effed up shit. So this is a very interesting take, and I really didn't think of it, but when you think of the whole push of Medra La Raza and having one identity that involves whiteness, it essentially is to erase indigenous ancestry. So, yeah, that makes sense. Confusingly, US American racial categorizations are only partially based on race. It also doesn't help that the entire concept of race, much like gender, is infinitely more complex than we imagine it to be. It's easy to fit someone of Irish or Ugandan or Korean ancestry into a racial group, but that's because these people typically fit neatly into a particular racial category. And this has to do with the three races, with Irish being originally called Caucasoid, then turned white, Ugandan originally being put into Negroid, now called Black, and Korean initially being put into Mongoloid, now called Asian. For those on the edges of racial categories, this distinction between white and not white becomes unclear. This is where Latinos fit, though I definitely do think they intentionally did this because some of them want to identify as white, but then when they see certain benefits that are going to other people, then they want to be people of color. And we saw a lot of this from the civil rights movement onward. Instead of fighting for a mestizo label, they instead fight for a Hispanic slash Latino label, which is way more open ended, and it seems like that's very intentional. White Latinos experience discrimination in ways that white non Latinos do not. Sometimes the discrimination is based around language. So that is linguistic xenophobia. That's not racism. Sometimes it's based on national origin, citizenship, culture, or whatever else people feel like discriminating against. That can be said for literally anyone, though. A lot of Italians deal with this. Heck, some Irish people deal with this. Heck, some people from the United Kingdom and immediately move to the US feel this way. This is not specific to race. So that's what's annoying about this entire thing. So when white Latinos are lumped into the same racial group as non-white Latinos slash indigenous Americans, it's because the way the two groups experience oppression has a lot in common. On the flip side, non-white Latinos experience a massive amount of discrimination that has nothing in common with the typical white Latino experience. So I'm glad they acknowledge this. So while it sometimes makes sense to group the two together, it is a category that's not always a particularly useful one, and that's definitely true. Ultimately, racial categories don't hold up to any amount of scrutiny because they're not meant to be rational. They are nothing more than an amalgamation of the general U.S. American bigotry. And that I agree with. If it's nonsensical, let's get rid of it entirely. But they don't want to get rid of race because they use it as a power structure. But if you're going to use it as a power structure, make it very linear. Okay, sheer American ignorance. White Hispanics are not considered POC in Latin American countries, but the average American has no idea of the intricate demographics of Latin American countries. So this persists. A lot of quote-unquote white Hispanics are still of partial indigenous and or African descent. Hispanic people, white or otherwise, are an ethnic minority in the U.S. whose people are mostly descended from Northwestern Europeans like the English, Scottish, and Germans. And so even white Hispanics are other in ways Italians and Irish people use to be. Okay. So it mentions people of partial indigenous and or African descent, which is true, but when a lot of the work within those communities went out of their way to erase their indigenous and or African descent and to erase people who are primarily of indigenous or African descent, do they really get to deserve to represent those people that they're trying to erase? An ethnic minority can be literally anyone. Irish Americans, French Americans, Spanish or Spaniard Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, whatever European country you come from, Americans are all ethnic minorities. If you want to be technical, right? White Hispanics, it's the same thing. The thing with the white Hispanics is that they aren't as put on a pedestal due to their linguistics, but they're confusing linguistics with race. Okay? So I really like this comment. People of color is a colonial term that white people created as a tool of genocide and ethnic cleansing of Native Americans. So I would not use it. Basically, POC is the racial theory of the USA, which states that everyone who is not white has commonality on the basis of race and color, due to not being white, and not being white in itself has a connotation of being black. Recently, in Arizona rap referred to quote-unquote colored people and black people, and the media is stating that he was talking about black people, but it's clear what he meant by colored, the same as POC, which is everyone who is not white. And I find this to be so stupid, because one, a lot of the people who are people of color don't even like black people and feel no commonality towards them or one another. And two, some of the people who are in this POC group are legally declared white and share a lot of phenotypical traits to white people. We are defined in terms of our relationship or our relations to black and white people as two sides of a racial binary. So white Latinos being made into PSC, like when the media said Antonio Banderas, a European Spaniard, was the lone POC and words, it's just a sign of how confused our country's culture of race is. My feeling is that the only racial binary we should believe in is the binary of native and non-native, and that we should not accept any racial labels imposed by non-natives for their own agenda. My advice is not question just why white Latinos are labeled POC, but why it's seen as okay to label natives as POC in the first place, and why we should make being not a white person as a central part of our racial identity. So this is a very interesting response that I didn't think of fully because obviously I am not of native descent, so certain perspectives I just won't be able to see. But I do agree that it's based on a linear of being white and non-white, and it's an exclusionary process. Okay, thanks for the response. I've also started to see things in a racial binary of native/non-native descent, particularly when looking at celebrities and other public personalities who are clearly of native and American descent, or mixed white/native, yet these celebrities, especially women, always identify as Hispanic and Latina, and seem to be confused about their ancestry/identity. For example, Latino celebrities, whether they speak Spanish or not, seem to think that people of African, Asian, or European descent who happen to be born in Latin America can represent interchangeable or be interchangeable with indigenous people who come from Latin America. And this comment says, unfortunately, in the USA, they're starting to adopt mestizaje already and pushing this agenda that Latinos are a sub-race of European, Black, African, and Indigenous people. We both know that Latin Americans are not a race, but that is how people in the USA understand the world. It is convenient for them to think of us as intrinsically a mixed race group rather than just a geographical or broad cultural group because it divorces us from our indigenous continental identity. The last thing they want is foreigners like us becoming self-aware of our true origins, when they could have us behave like a meek, racially undefined immigrant group. In a sense, it is Mr. Shash all over again. The last thing they want to do is acknowledge Native Americans as a racial group the way they do black people. And that is why there's so much about quote-unquote Afro-Latinos in the last 10 years in the media, but they pretend like people who look like us are raceless. The mentality that borders determine race is why Sachin Littlefeather was dragged through the month, despite us both knowing she was of this continent. Okay, I'm gonna skip some of this just to see some different commentary. So this one's a long one. Almost all white Hispanics from Mexico or further south are very related to indigenous people too. They are mostly who controlled Mexico, and Spain is very rarely sent any woman over. Almost all the women they took to make babies with were at least partially indigenous for about 400 years. It really wasn't like that in the US at all, where most people who came over were in family groups and lots of women migrated. Skin color is just weird. When both parents have different skin colors, you can end up with anything in between. A lot of white people in Mexico just happen to have got white skin, but it doesn't make them any less related to Native people. This is why all Mexicans were declared mixed around 1920 after the Mexican Revolution and still are today. And well, the real heart of your question involves a lot of history. At first, after the Mexican Revolution, the US Census only asked if someone was Mexican, but they didn't notice any big difference in numbers, even though they knew a large group of Mexicans had migrated north during that war. Back then, the borders weren't very controlled, so they didn't know exactly how many. Later, they figured out that most of the darker-skinned Mexicans had migrated back after the war ended, and the whiter ones that were in power had stayed in the U.S., as Mexico was no longer safe for them. They had lost the war. Interesting. So then the US Census tried asking them if they were Spanish, Mexican, or white, but many responded with white, as their families hadn't lived in Spain for hundreds of years. And that's definitely a thing with a lot of people who leave countries and their families stay in that country for generations. That's when they added on the Hispanic ethnicity question and finally found the numbers they were expecting. You can see this graphed out here. I'm sure it has a bit to do with the drop theory of race too. Since all Mexicans have at least a drop of native ancestry, the US wouldn't have seen them as actually white. Okay, blah blah blah, we're skipping down. I can't speak for all Latin Americans, but for Mexicans, it's a small percentage of people that are 100% European or 100% indigenous. Sure, there are areas that are heavily indigenous like Chiapas, Yucatan, and Oaxaca, while Sonora, parts of Guanajuato, and Jalisco are heavily European, but the rest of Mexico is extremely mixed. Even the places I just mentioned, the people are still mixed, just less so. Also, take into account that genetics are a funny thing. You don't always present, phenotypically speaking, as what makes up the largest portion of your ancestry. This is why it's problematic to create these stupid quote-unquote color categories. Culture matters, race is imaginary at best, and a harmful lie at worst. Okay, this is a long one. I'll try to explain this as best as I can. Latin America became a separate category in the United States of America because they wanted to keep immigrants from other colonies, specifically Latin colonies, separate and keep an eye on the flow of immigrants from here. Seeing as Spanish colonies where many immigrants were coming from, they wanted another category to more specifically keep an eye on Spain and their movements, so they created Hispanic as a category. Since over the years, who is white has changed. French and Portuguese were allowed access to complete whiteness. There was no qualifier unless you were from a colony/colony born. This labeling still persists even though many of these countries and states/provinces, in the case of Quebec and rare Louisiana and Florida, are no longer colonies. Due to allow Latin Americans identify as white when given the opportunity to self-identify, even when they were of mixed and or non-white descent, a lot of people developed skepticism about Latin Americans' backgrounds. So that just proof that also brought up the point that I mentioned where a lot of non-white Latinos identified as white in the US for a plethora of reasons. Recently, someone pointed out that because Latin American countries are more integrating of their subgroups than the USA is of theirs, there's a lot of anti-indigenous, anti-black, and anti-Spanish/Portuguese/French sentiment in the othering of people of Latin American descent, of Latin American descent, due to the natural cultures and the way of life, including from multiple groups. This is why white Hispanic and white Latin persons may not face problems because of their ancestry being European. They will face problems because they have ancestry/background not just from Europe but from Latin America and from Spanish ex-colonies, with the exceptions of Spanish persons. Not sure why they are still othered by association to their ex-colonies. So, from what I could gather, there's a battle due to Anglophone and Hispanic colonization, which is why they may face some discrimination and they're not fully from Europe. In Latin American, a white Latin American would be white as they are in their own country. When they leave, they are no longer simply white. They are white and Latin American, so there's a different label there. Anyways, point is, they may not face racial discrimination off of appearance alone, but they do off of ancestry/culture. They face less discrimination, but they still face it. They aren't allowed to just be white. They must be white Latin/Hispanic. As such, solidarity is created and union under discrimination faced due to being under the label of POC or non-white. Again, not sure what's going on with white Spanish, i.e. Spaniard. Also, minority because the majority is simply white. So essentially, the fact that they can't just be white is why they're seen as other, despite them coming from a different colonized area. That's what I'm grasping from this. Okay. This comment mentions the only real Latinos or Hispanics are white. Wow, I'm pretty sure they meant to say white. They colonized what's now South America, and so the people they colonized are called Hispanic or Latino in an effort to erase who they really are. So yet again, this racial argument comes up again. And the reply underneath says, that is the truth. I believe mestizos, castizos, and mulattoes should be used on the U.S. Census. And mulatto was used on the U.S. Census, but they removed it because they wanted to distance anyone who was non-white but had white ancestry from white people and push them closer to the quote-unquote throwaway blacks category. Okay. So this person asks, what is a white Latin American? Like their ancestors settled in Mexico from Germany or something? The reply says, people of Spanish descent, Europeans who settled or colonized Latin American places, etc. Then another reply says, not necessarily Spanish though. There's Brazil, a country where most people have some degree of Portuguese ancestry. Venezuela and Uruguay also have a sizable Portuguese descendant population. South America itself has more Italian descendants, mixed and white, than Europe and North America do. Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo have more Italian descendants than any city in Italy does. Plus, there were German, French, and Irish people that more or less settled in many parts of Latin America. Europeans did move to the region during World War II, and etc. Again, this is a part of the open immigration process from Europe to South America, or to Latin America, my bad. It should be noted that the term Spanish actually includes various ethnic groups, so Basques, Catalans, Galicians, Canarians, etc. So a bunch of different Spanish groups in Spain. Referring to all of them as Spanish is like calling all Scottish, English, and Welsh descendants in North America British. Okay, so this person mentioned, well, as the term implies, it refers to white people living in Latin America. Most of them from Spanish and or Portuguese ancestry, but do find other European ancestries as well. Most common ones are Italians, Germans, and French. It should also be known that many Lebanese descendants, Latin America has a large Lebanese diaspora in the entire world, even more than Lebanon itself. Consider themselves to be white, despite having no European background. And this also ties into the whole Middle Eastern North African people being declared white in the United States, just like Latin Americans. And I've discussed that here and there in another video and in the past. And it's the same pathology there. And when you look at the original concepts of race from centuries ago, Middle West Asians and North Africans were always considered Caucasoid. Okay. This person says, my friend who's Egyptian and I were talking about how groups that appear non-white on paper and in person consider themselves white, or Southern Italians and Spanish are white or brown. It opened my eyes a bit. I have no insight, judgment, or strong opinions here, just interested in the conversation. I mean, I don't know how it works in other countries, but not all Lebanese descendants can pull off the white card and identify as such. If they're brown-skinned and non-white looking for Mexican descendants, they are just considered to be mestizo, even if they have little to no Native American or European ancestry, which is what mestizo means. Mexicans with Lebanese ancestry like Miguel Sabah, Salma Hayek, and Omar Fayad will never be called white here, but others like Demian Bichir, Dario Yazbek, and Miguelian are consider themselves to be white. A lot of white Hispanic / Latins like to claim they are part indigenous or mestizo. It's a really weird thing where they get to both be white and a minority just because they have the last name Cruz or Gonzalez. Some Latinos have white skin and are predominantly of Native ancestry. Genetics are complicated, don't stereotype. To be fair, white Latinos really notice they're white. It's always the white Hispanics that cry racism but go on to be anti-black or Indian. They refuse to recognize their privilege. And that's the main issue here that I've seen when it comes to this discussion, the representation in the media, and the racism within the communities, but also wanting to claim minority as well. Or whenever there's something involving black people, they come in saying, oh, what about us? When it wasn't about them, and they hold just as bad anti-black sentiment in their countries. So, we're gonna get to this comment. It's a long one. These racial designations originally come from the census. In the middle of the 20th century, there is both an increased focus on ending discriminatory government policies and also a large population explosion of Mexican and Puerto Rican people in particular. So the census began to track Spanish and Hispanic people as their own group because these groups were becoming more populous and thus more visible to the mostly white or mostly Anglo people who made the government policy. And I do believe that's the reason why the Hispanic group became a thing, because they were getting a lot of people from these countries, but they didn't know how to track them well. So Hispanic was created, or Latino was created, so they could track these group of people down, population-wise. It's more or less just how white people of the mid-20th century conceptualized it. This is obviously problematic for a lot of reasons. People from Mexico and people from Puerto Rico and people from Peru have a lot of differences even among populations that identify as your descendant, as they came to places with different cultures. A Cuban diaspora community in Florida is very different culturally than a Mexican diaspora community in Southern California, and it's very different from a Puerto Rican diaspora community in New York. And that I definitely agree with. And I do see a lot of infighting with those groups because, one, a lot of them have different genetic makeups, two, they have different cultural customs, and three, they came to this country very differently under very different circumstances, too. Another obvious one being that a lot of these Hispanic immigrants were not Spanish speaking, like the large populations of indigenous Mexican and indigenous Central American people in particular were completely unrecognized. There are about 150,000 Nahua speakers in the US. It's not a small number of people. Even of those that were Spanish speaking, many didn't particularly like the label. In the 80s, we partially migrated to using the term Latino, which came from objections from anti-colonial Puerto Ricans who didn't particularly like being labeled Spanish by the government. So, okay, that makes sense as to why they changed it from Hispanic or Spanish to that. Though this term is only used in the US, Latino America is used in geography, but there's no ethnic identity associated with it or anybody self-identifying as Latino in Latin America itself. And I think that's another kind of problematic element to this, where this label doesn't exist in Latin America. They either call themselves white, or whatever equivalent term to that, mestizo, so on and so forth. Or they refer to themselves by their nationality. Then soon after we got to the point where we are now, where they also realized that a lot of these people identified as white. So we get another little box to track those people who identified as white but who are also Hispanic. It doesn't really make sense or have any real cultural meaning. It's just white racial identify translated to the context of the Census and Demographic Tracking of the Civil Rights Act and the EEO compliance. So this came up around the Civil Rights Act era. Pretty much, that's what I got from this, and from the little bit that I know, this makes sense. It gets even weirder than that. It's still common to refer to Euro Americans as Caucasian, even in government documents. This is just straight up 19th century racist junk science that has no meaning whatsoever, even the context of the very fucked up world of American racial identity. It sounds sciencey and formal, so it's frequently used with the intent of sounding authoritative. Okay, so that's it for the article. Or, sorry, this Reddit piece. Alrighty, so I want to go through the history of race and ethnicity across the decades in the United States. And obviously, there are sources here at the bottom that was used for this. And it goes from the timeline of least recent to the most recent. Least recent being from the left and the most recent being to the right. For the 1930 census, Mexican was introduced as a category. Prior to the 1930 census, Mexicans had been categorized as white. So where's this lie coming from where Hispanic people were never identified and legally recognized as white and didn't live white lives? Where's this coming from? So they had their own category here for the first time, and prior to that, they were white. And as you see here, they got rid of the mulatto category because they really wanted to one job everyone of black descent into the Negro category. Now we're going to move on to 1940. The 1940 census used the same racial categories as the 1930 census, with the exception that Mexican was dropped. We're going to get into why that was. After the 1930 census, Mexican Americans, with the help of the Mexican government, lobbied against the continued use of Mexican as a separate category in the race question. Ultimately, the lobbying succeeded and Mexican was dropped as a separate category for all future censuses, although it was to reappear several decades later as a national origin category in the Hispanic origin question. So pretty much this happened because Mexicans were mad that they weren't considered white, and they felt like identifying as Mexican would lose their white privilege. So they fought to have that category removed so they can integrate fully into whiteness. So yet again, this further goes into the history of Hispanics identifying as white because they genuinely saw themselves at that and saw it as more advantageous. There is no person of color, nothing. They were white. Now let's move to 1950. Okay, so we see the reduction of racial categories, where Korean and Hindu were removed, and the term Indian was changed to American Indian in order to distinguish American Indians from those with origins in India. So, pretty much you had the American Indians, the Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese, then the Negro, white, where Mexicans were put under, and other Hispanic people were put under, and other. As you see here in the 1960s, there is an addition of his Hawaiian and part Hawaiian. Okay, interesting. A specific category titled Other was not used in race questions for the 1960 census. Rather, the list of racial categories for respondents to choose from ended with etc. So, yet again, it's not like Hispanics were identifying as other. Now we're seeing, as you see, people of Hispanic origin or Latin origin, they are represented by the green, so we see an increase in that within the 1970s. 1970, the White House instructed the Secretary of Commerce to add a Hispanic self-identification question to the 19th census form. The question asks, is this person's origin or descent? The respondent categories used were Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American, other Spanish, though Spanish is a language, and if you're referring to the people of Spanish, that's Europe, and no, none of these. As the largest estimated Hispanic populations in the United States at the time, Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban origins were separately identified. Increased immigration from Korea influenced the return to that category in the 1970 census. The Negro category now included the term black, which proponents linked to the ethnic pride that flourished as the result of the civil rights movement. Additionally, the American Indian category was changed to Indian MR to reduce the number of respondents initially selecting this category because they identified with the term American. So you see the mention of Hispanic as a language or linguistic barrier because they were receiving a lot of people from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba specifically, and they wanted to track those numbers down. But it says nothing about their racial identity. Okay, I'm going to scroll down for 1980. In 1977, the Office of Management and Budget, or MB, is the acronym, issued its Directive 15 policy on racial and ethnic classification for federal data, defining the basic racial and ethnic. So notice how it's not just racial, they're separating ethnic too, which is kind of very loopholey. Categories for several federal statistics and program administrative reporting. The 1977 OMB Race and Ethnic Standards maintained that ethnicity, not what's in the brackets, Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So they acknowledge that Hispanic isn't a race. So let's rewind it back. The 1977 OMB Race and Ethnic Standards maintained that ethnicity, Hispanic or not Hispanic, so this could apply to anyone, is a separate and distinct concept from race. White, black, American Indian or Alaska Native, or Asian or Pacific Islander. Therefore, individuals who are Hispanic may be of any race. So they didn't even really have their own separate category, and they could still apply under Hispanic white, which a lot of them did, Hispanic black, Hispanic American Indian, or so on and so forth. In the 1980 census, the Mexican category was expanded to include Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano. No. And they also introduced a few other Asian or Pacific Islander categories for 1980. Now let's go to 1990. In 1990, for the Hispanic origin question, a list of examples and a right in line were introduced. Print one group, for example, Argentinian, Colombian, Dominican, Nicaraguan, Salvadorian, Spaniard, and so on. And then they added a few others to the API groups. Okay. So for the 2000 census, in 1997, OMB issued revised race and ethnicity standards. The race question allowed the reporting of more than one race. There are two separate questions of race and ethnicity when collecting data via self-identification, yet again, acknowledging that race and ethnicity are different. The final race categories were white, black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. So, nothing about Hispanic or Latino was mentioned in the race categories. The final ethnicity categories were Hispanic or Latino and non-Hispanic or Latino. This was the first time the term Latino was introduced, so wow, so it wasn't even 40 years old. So it's the 2000s. The some other race category, long part of the census, was not included in either the 1977 OMB Directive 15 or the 1997 OMB Revised Race and Ethnic Standards. However, the 2005 Omnibus Appropriations Bill stated none of the funds provided in this or any other act for any fiscal year may be used for the collection of census data on race identification that does not include some other race as a category. And now we're going to go to the final category. So for the 2010 census, a new instruction was added to immediately preceding the questions on Hispanic origin and race. The instruction stated that for the census, Hispanic origins are not races, because in the federal statistical system, Hispanic origin is considered to be a separate concept from race. There were two changes to the question on race. One, the wording of the race question was changed to, what is this person's race? Marks X, one or more boxes, so you can fit in more than one race. Two examples were added to the other Asian response category: Hmong, Laotian, Thai, Pakistani, Cambodian, and so on. And the other Pacific Islander response category, so like Fijian, Tongan, and so on. There are three changes to the Hispanic origin question. One, the wording of the question changed to, is this person of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Two, the question provided no specific instruction for non-Hispanic respondents. And three, the yes, another Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin category provided examples of 6 Hispanic origin groups, like Argentinian, Colombian, Dominican, Nicaraguan, Salvadorian, Spaniard, and so on, and instructed respondents to print origin. So throughout this entire timeline, Hispanic and Latino was never considered a race because they acknowledged that anyone of any race could be Latino or Hispanic as long as they have ancestry from or lived in or came from that area. For this part, now we're going to do some math. As you see here, I am using usafacts.org as a reference point for demographics of Hispanic Americans. And this graph covers the last 4 decades, where it states that the Hispanic population increased by 47 million since 1980. But I first want to point down the amount of Hispanics that were in each decade in America on this part, and then we're going to later look into how many identify as white. So at 1980, there was 14, hold on, 1980, 14, 603, 683, 603, 683. Now we're going to do the same thing for 1990, where there's 22, 354, 22, 354, 059. And note how it says of any race, acknowledging that it ain't a race. Now we're going to move on to 2000, where it's 35, 305, 818. Now we're going to do the same thing with 2010, 50, 477, 594. And then the most recent one, obviously 2020, 62088, 044. Alrighty. So it definitely has increased by 47 million within the last 4 decades. And then we're going to look at another graph. So let's just read this part. Census data also indicates growing demographic variations within this group. Hispanic Americans trace their ethnicity to dozens of countries of origin. Since the terms Latino or Hispanic refers to ethnicity, not race, there are Hispanic Americans in every racial group. So here it says 2/3 of Hispanic Americans identify as white. In 2019, the latest year for which the racial breakdown of the Hispanic population is available, so they haven't done any since. 39.7 million out of 60.5 million Hispanics identified as white. So this whole talk of what are white Hispanics and there's no such thing, BS! The second largest racial group among Hispanics is the some other race category. There were 15.5 million people in this group in 2019, representing 26% of all Hispanic Americans. 3 million or 5% of Hispanics identified as multiracial. So, with a lot of Latinos or Hispanics being multiracial, why is it that only 5% of them identify as that when that's technically what they are and what makes them special? We're going to get into the second graph, and look here. Though, just from the title here, it says, in 2019, 91% of the Hispanic population identified as white or some other race. So, remember over here, this is the overall category for the amount of Hispanics in the US. Now we're going to do white, You know what, I'm just going to focus on white because that's the main topic of discussion. So as we see here, 8,115,256. and 256. That's the amount that identified as white in 1980. 8,115,256. 256. I'm going to do the same thing for 1990. 11,557,774. 11557. I think 744. I want to double check. Yeah, 774. Okay. $2,000. 16,839. 16,839. 585. 2010. 37,405. I wonder why the number jumped so much larger from 2000 to 2010. Okay, now let's see. I'm gonna do some data. And I think, hold on. Mexican Americans represent the most prominent Hispanic origin with a population of 37.2 million, about 61% of all Hispanics. Puerto Ricans are the second largest Hispanic group, which makes sense because they're technically a territory in the United States. In the United States, which includes all states and Washington, D.C., not Puerto Rico, 5.8 million or 10% of the Hispanic population identify as Puerto Rican. Hold on. No, it doesn't even state what they identified as in 2020 when it came to the. Oh, yeah, because that was the last year they did a racial breakdown. Okay. So we're going to get a calculator. Yeah. Okay. Let's widen this up now. 8,115,256 divided by 14,603,683. What's the data? Okay, so by this, since we're rounding up, 56%. 56% of Hispanics identified as white in 1980. Could do the same thing for the 90s. 11,557,774 divided by 22,354,059. Okay, so it did went down about 52%. 52% of Hispanics identified as white in 1990. $16,839,585 divided by 35,305,818. 48%. Okay. So it was decreasing over the decades, which is good, though not by much. But still show that there's a decent size, or about half of the Hispanic population is white. So now we're going to go to 2010. 37,405, 604 divided by 50, 477, 594. Did I do my math correctly? Okay, 74. It says 74 here based on the data. We're gonna see. Okay, in 2019, 91% of the Hispanic population identified as white or some other race. I didn't track the numbers for some other race. Maybe I should, but yeah. So out of that 91% that identified as white or another race, 74% of that group identified as white, meaning that only 16% of that initial 91 identified as some other race. So, where's this belief that white Latinos don't exist? Where's this belief that a whole bunch of them don't identify as white? Where's this belief that they don't exist? Where's this belief that, oh, you're making this up? Latinos have always been separate from white people in the US. According to this data from the last 4 decades, that isn't true. And even going back, a lot more of them identified as white. So where all of this controversy and the confusion about their identity really isn't that confusing. I feel like if they distinctly had a mixed race category on the census and then you put your different type of mix, whether it's black white mixed, black Asian mixed, or mestizo mixed, things would be so much clearer. So, from what I just discussed, it talked from the 80s to the 2010s, but it didn't really discuss the 2020s. So, I'm on Pew Research Center where they added up the data based on the 2020 census, and we're going to delve a bit into it. So, as you see here, they looked into the racial identity among they measured the racial identity amongst Hispanics based on 4 categories. So the first was the survey question of what is your race of origin, i.e., white, black or African American, Asian or Asian American, 2 or more races or some other race or origin. Then the second one says, how would most people describe you if, for example, they walk past you on the street, where they say you are white, Hispanic or Latino, black or African American, Asian or Asian American, Native American or Indigenous, the Native people of the Americas such as Mayan, Quechua or Taino, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, mixed race or multiracial, or other blank. Then, it's, in your own words, if you could describe your race or origin in any way you wanted, how would you describe yourself? And the last one being, which of these most closely match your own skin color, even if none of them is exactly right? If this question makes you uncomfortable, you may skip it. So based on the Census Bureau standards, of all Hispanics, 58% of them identify as white when they're checking off the census, despite having the options of 2 or more races, which technically most Latinos are, and some other race. So almost 60% identify as white. US born, literally 60% of them identify as white, and the foreign born, 56% of them identify as white. So, more than half of Hispanics in the survey identified their race as white, with the next largest sharing or selecting some other race, which isn't specific at all. And then 8% selecting 2 or more races, which, with them mentioning they're multiracial, you would have thought more of them would have chosen that. And 2% selecting black or African American. So now we're moving on to the Latino skin color reflecting the diversity within the group. So we're just going to scroll down and look at the picture. So there's 10 shades of skin tones here. If you look at the 6 darker skin tones, literally only 15% of them fit in that description, and it says 80% here and 15% there, but there's 5% missing somewhere. But anyways, within the first 4 categories of the lightest skin tones, 80% of them fit under the first 4. And if you break down the data even more, 13% of them have the lightest skin tone, 28% of them has the second lightest, 21% has the third lightest, and 17% have the fourth lightest. So most Latinos or Hispanics are extremely light. So when it comes to what people would describe them as they're walking down the street, there's an overwhelming amount of them would be called Hispanic. And this results in all Hispanics, no matter whether they're second generation, third or higher, or foreign born. Most people describe them as Hispanic when going down the street. 68% of the second generation people will describe them as Hispanic. Foreign born, 75% of them would be described as Hispanic, which makes sense that this will be the highest since they were literally born in their Hispanic countries and then migrating to the US. And then third generation higher would identify as Hispanic. But as we all know, Hispanic just refers to linguistics. Either you speak Spanish or come from a Spanish-speaking nation. It really says nothing about your racial makeup. But people wouldn't deem them as white just from walking down the street. And it shows how racial identity is very complicated. So just based on this, 6 to 7%, or 67 out of 10 would say that they would be called Hispanic when going down the street. So when it comes to how Hispanic people identify themselves, if they click on something, they either click Hispanic, Latino, Hispanic, country of their origin. So like they would say, oh, I'm Cuban because I come from Cuba, or I've descended from Cuba. Same thing with Peru, Puerto Rico, especially Mexico, so on and so forth. So based on all the Hispanics, they would either just say they're Hispanic/Latino, or they'd say their country of origin. Foreign born, a lot more of them would say Hispanic compared to their country of origin. I find that interesting that they say Hispanic and Latino more than the country of origin, though I think they say that because they want to blend in to America more, and they feel like saying Hispanic and Latino would do that. The second generation, more of them identify with the Hispanic country of origin instead of Hispanic, and it's pretty much the same thing with third or generation or higher. But interestingly enough, once you go into the second generation or higher, the American identifier rises, the white shrinking, then increases, and so does the other race increase. Okay, so now this last category is how the four racial identity measures correlate with one another. And this graph pretty much covers it. So the highest at 12% is lighter skin, white, Hispanic, or Hispanic/Latino. So this means they identify as Hispanic, but if they have to choose a race, they'll choose white, and they identify as being lighter skinned. At 8%, it's lighter skin, white, Hispanic country of origin. So let's just say I'm lighter skin, white, Cuban, Hispanic. Then the third is lighter skin, some other race, Hispanic Latino. Then the fourth highest is lighter skin, white at 5%, and the other two's at 6% and 8%. Lighter skin, some other race, Hispanic country of origin, lighter skin, white, Hispanic country of origin. But as you see here, there's a lot of white. So now it's time to do some data. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go with a 2-question format. White. So the first category has 12%, then 8%, then 5%, then 5%, then 4%, then 4%, then 3%, then 3%. So go to the calculator, add it up. 12.8, 0.5, 0.5, 0.4, 0.4, 0.3, 0.3. So solely out of the two-question format and of these categories, it's literally 45%. No matter which combination will identify as white on their paperwork. Now when it comes to street race, you have 5% for white, 5%, 4%, and 3%. So I could just do this off the top of my head. 5 plus 5 equals 10, plus 4 is 14, 17%. And then open-ended, I could just do the numbers here, 5, 8%. So this is really interesting. When it comes to governmental and legal stuff, a lot of them identify as white, probably because they feel like they can get more privileges on the governmental legal side of things by identifying as white. But when you're on the street and how other people identify you, a lot of them aren't called white, and as you see here, it's only 17%. And when it comes to open-ended and how they identify themselves, very few of them identify as white just by that, if they were asked their identity and all of that. Alrighty, so this was longer than I intended it being, but this is how I feel in conclusion about the whole Rachel Zegler controversy when it came to her racial/ethnic background and how it played into what happened with the Snow White and the historical context regarding white Latinos and this struggle with their identity in the United States of America. I don't really have anything else to say. Thank you all for whomever watched this, and I'll be back with some more content in the future. Take care.